MTN share price continues to be down more than 20% as the Nigerian investigation on the Central Bank of Nigeria demands for it and lenders to refund more than $8 billion of money it alleges that MTN moved out the country illegally. Joining me now via Skype to discuss this is Kayode Akindele, who's a partner at TIA Capital. Kayode, thanks so much for your time. Now, investors here in South Africa are really questioning this whole news that emerged from the Central Bank of Nigeria yesterday. And they are saying that there is no way that MTN could have illegally moved money out of the country without the approval of the Central Bank itself. I mean, how do you respond to this?
Well, I think it's really an administrative and technical issue. What happens, the whole CCI process is governed with strict rules. And what has come about from what we've seen from what CBN has said is that the CCI process was not done properly over, looks like an 8-year period. And funds were moved with the wrong CCIs. Now, what the Central Bank of Nigeria is saying is that the money should be brought back and the CCI is regularized, and the banks that were involved have been fined.
Because the issue is now these CCIs went through the banking process and then they were approved by the central bank itself. So now who's at fault here? If the central bank already gave the approval, why almost so many years later turn around to say that no, this was not done properly?
Well, if you look at the central bank statement, they mentioned two things. Firstly was the conversion of equity into preference shares. And they said that they received temporary approval from CBN, but not final approval before that was done. Now, on the back of that, there were CCIs were then issued and funds were moved based on those CCIs. So what Central Bank of Nigeria is saying is that two things. Firstly, the conversion to preference shares did not receive final approval. So you cannot remit funds based on that. Secondly, the CCIs, through various administrative lapses by the banks, and that's why the banks have been fined, were not done properly. And so what they're trying to do is, this has been a 2-year investigation. This first came up in 2016 and was investigated by National Assembly last year and has been under investigation for a while. So what they've finally come up back with is that, look, that amount of money that left Nigeria did not leave in the right way. Now, should the central bank really be asking MTN to bring back the $8 billion for them to just take it back out again? It seems a bit unnecessary. I think the fines for the Nigerian banks and maybe a warning to MTN about going forward, making sure that bankers are doing what is supposed to, according to Nigerian law, it should have been sufficient.
And can you clarify that for us? Because there's a little bit of a confusion. I mean, who is actually being asked to pay the money back here? Is it the banks that facilitated the repatriation, or is it MTN?
What central bank is saying is that to the banks and MTN is that the slightly over $8 billion that was remitted under this process should be returned to Nigeria, and then the process should be done properly for the money to then leave. It just, to me, I don't think the central bank should be going that far. I think what has happened is an administrative error, and if there are fines, people should pay the fines. But asking entities to bring back such a large amount of money only to repatriate it probably the next day just seems a bit of overreach.
And then, I mean, in the event that, this happens, what exchange rates are we looking at here? Are we talking about the current exchange rates? Or are we talking about the old exchange rates then, which I do understand were around $1.99 to the dollar?
It will be the original exchange rate, because if this process does happen, all that will happen is that $8 billion will then be remitted to Nigeria, and then a CCI will be issued. The correct CCIs will be issued with correct CBN approvals, and then money will probably be remitted back within a week at that same exchange rate. So it's really just a circular movement of money.
I mean, can you talk to me about the timing of this? Because this is another concern that's been raised. I mean, in 2015, when the original fine was levied on MTN for it not playing the right ball when it came to SIM cards and registrations there, that was before an election. Now we also have a timing that coincides with an upcoming election in Nigeria. We also have a Nigerian government whose purse is under strain. So is this a situation where Nigeria could possibly be relying on its biggest investor for some money for elections?
I don't think so. As I said earlier, this has been this whole series of transactions have been under investigation since 2016. So it's not a new investigation. Secondly, this $8 billion does not belong to the Nigerian government. Nigerian government is not claiming it belongs to it. What Nigerian government is saying is that the process of remitting the funds did not adhere to Nigerian law. So you should redo the process and adhere to Nigerian law. So the money is not going to be able, they're not going to be able to use the money for elections. I think what we're seeing here is that there has been a more regulatory focus, especially on big multinationals in Nigeria, and trying to ensure that the laws of Nigeria are being adhered to. Unfortunately, given MTN's market size and position in the Nigerian market, it seems like the hammer has fallen on them more than others.
I mean, Kayode, I was speaking to some of your colleagues earlier today, and they say that this will naturally delay the listing of MTN there on Nigeria's stock exchange. But what message do you think this sends to other multinationals wanting to do business there in Nigeria? I mean, all this tightened regulatory frameworks that are coming about, this red tape, it really doesn't speak to the case that Nigeria is open for business.
It depends how you look at it. Some could argue that Nigeria has been quite lax previously in regulatory matters, and proper tightening up of regulatory matters is required. If MTN is not the only multinational in Nigeria, and I think one question that needs to be asked is that given the likes of Shell, Chevron, a number of other multinationals that have operated in Nigeria for many years and don't seem to have had these kind of problems, why is it MTN that have had these problems, these two potentially big issues involved? I think for this second one, in terms of the remittances, I think a lot of the blame goes into MTN's banks, to be honest. I think the only slight matter that you could argue MTN did wrong was not getting final approval for the conversion to preference shares. But that's an administrative issue. But I think going forward, what a lot of investors would want in Nigeria is a level playing field and consistent regulatory actions. Now, if Nigerian regulators are going to be consistent going forward in adhering to the rule of law, then I think investors will be happy because there's a level playing field and everyone knows the consistency of regulation. But if it's just, as you say, ad hoc, which sometimes it does seem like it's ad hoc, then there are going to be issues, and for investors, that's not good.
And just finally, I mean, what do you think will happen if MTN says, you know, clearly we don't quite get the regulatory framework there in Nigeria, we're throwing in the towel, we're tired of billions and billions of dollars in fines, we're pulling out. What does that mean for Nigeria's economy?
It will be quite a big blow in the sense that MTN is obviously one of the biggest private sector taxpayers. It controls probably upwards to 50% of the mobile phone market, and it's a big player. And they spend billions of dollars in capex in Nigeria on an annual basis. But saying that, Nigeria if you look at what MTN have achieved and what's come out through this process is that MTN roughly puts in about $400 million worth of equity. What they want to call it shareholder loans or preference shares, they put about $400 million worth of equity. And they took out $8 billion in an 8-year period. Those sort of returns are pretty impressive. So I think if MTN wants to give up his license in regards to this, I think there'll be quite a few other takers who would like to take it up.
Well, we will leave it there. Thanks so much for your very sobering insights on what is going on there. Not sounding as panicked as some of the South African investors here who have sold the stock down heavily. But Kayode, thanks so much for your time once again. That was Kayode Akindele, who is a partner at TIA Capital.